we're recording. It's live preparing. All right, yes, indeed. All right, good evening. Welcome to Pep Talk. I'm your host, Leon Theodore. Pep Talks are frank conversations about the state of education today. Joining the conversation today is Monika Robinson, racial equity and implicit bias trainer. Welcome, Monika. Thank you for being here.
Hi, thank you.
So the disparities in our school discipline system, both nationally and here in Dallas, has been highlighted by recent current events. The use of zero tolerance practices and the over-disciplining of our youth of color, specifically Black youth, has continued the flow of Black boys and girls into the school to prison pipeline. Our educational system spends vast amounts of money on security services and minuscule amounts on social and emotional well-being of our youth. Systemic racism, racist practices and policies have impacted communities of color, but specifically Black communities, creating wealth and opportunity gaps that have spilled over into our educational system. Implicit bias, racist practices and policies has criminalized Black student behavior while dismissing and minimizing the same behavior in other students. Zero tolerance policies and practices are proven not to change students' behavior, but increase aggression, and they're acting out. The call for restorative justice is loud and clear. It's a clarion call, and we're here to heed that call. So, like I said, today's topic is racial equity and the classroom experience. And I'm really happy to have Monika here because she has so much experience in that. And she's a passionate trainer. She's a passionate educator. And she is, I like a strong sister. And I like that. I'm proud to know you, and I'm proud to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Monika, if you would tell me a little bit about yourself, please.
Yeah, so I'm a former educator. I taught elementary school. I worked in 3 different districts across DFW. I worked in mostly Title I schools. But what's funny about that is that oftentimes I was the only Black teacher. So there were many Latinx teachers, but not as many Black teachers. So I was often the only Black teacher. I decided in 2015 that I thought I wanted to be a principal. So I went and got a master's degree in education administration. But then I started realizing that I'm more passionate about school reform. So I thought, I can do more outside of the school district. So I did work for 2 more years as an instructional coach in Irving ISD. And then I left the public education system, never to return, because I wanted to focus more on the change that was needed. So now I work in nonprofit. I've been working for an education nonprofit in Dallas, and we focus more on literacy. But I train other educators in literacy and also in racism and racial equity and kind of just the how we got to where we are now, because I want educators to realize that the system was never designed for Black and brown students. And so we talk a lot about like the history of racism in Dallas and just to educate them more about that. So I'm passionate about that. And I'm also been working as an educational consultant with another organization where I'm learning about culturally responsive teaching, and I'm going to be facilitating those trainings as well.
Yes. Thank you very much for that. And the thing about when we talk about racial equity has become a buzzword. And usually when things become a buzzword, they lose their potency. And, when we're talking about, well, let me ask you explain what racial equity in education means to you.
So to me, racial equity is when everyone gets what they need, right? Equality is when everyone gets the same thing, right? And so equity it's a good thing. I think that people use it interchangeably sometimes with equality, and it's not the same. There's a great visual that's out there that you've probably seen it, Leon, before, where it has like three kids and they're against a fence, or three people and they're standing up against a fence. There's a small child, a bigger child, and an adult, and they're all looking out on a baseball field. And then they each need different things to be able to see above the fence. Like the little tiny kid needs like two or three crates to be able to see above the fence. The middle child just needs one crate, and the adult doesn't need anything to be able to see over the fence. So that's kind of a visual of what equity is versus equality. They would have all gotten nothing, or they would have all gotten one crate to stand on or whatever. So that's just kind of a visual to help you understand about equity versus equality. And I think right now, Black students need something different than what white students need, due to the years of discrimination and denial of access and opportunity. That's the situation that we find ourselves in.
Okay. Well, so then I was happy that this came up during this time, especially in this climate, a change in presidency. That means that our education department is going to change. Yes, I agree. I'm trying to be
models on inauguration.
Yes, moderate, right? But yes. So, with that change, our current administration passed something called the 1776. Trump signed something, 1776 Commission, which was promoting patriotic education, basically saying that what we're teaching now with racial equity and defining black pedagogies, things like that, that it's causing divisiveness. But what you're saying with the visual that you talked about, that means that our kids aren't getting what they need. And especially when we think about, we've talked before about implicit bias, and we've talked about social emotional learning. For us, when you say racial equity training, what are you proposing? What are you talking about doing? What do you see as the solution?
Well, the way we do school today, it hasn't changed all that much from generations before, right? The technology has changed, but kids are still sitting in desks, right? Still raising their hands, still walking in line. They're still sending kids to the principal's office where they misbehave, which is most often our Black and brown kids, which I know you're working very hard to change. We still grade A, B, C, D, right? We still rely on these flawed standardized tests that were created with white students in mind. None of that was created for the benefit of Black students, none of it. But here we are still doing much of that same thing today. Now, there are progressive schools and progressive school districts out there, charter schools. I'm not denying that. Yes, there's people that have started doing different things. But by and large, in Texas, nothing really has changed. And that has a lot to say about TEA and their leadership. And you can look at their leadership and see who's leading TEA, the Texas Education Agency, who makes the laws that govern, public education in Texas. So to me, we have to change the system. And I'm preaching to the choir because you already know that systemic change is hard. But we're just, kind of scratching and clawing and doing what we can. So I think educating educators about racism, about its effects, and how we got to where we are today is a good start, because they are not receiving that type of training in college prep programs. They're not receiving it from the school districts. So the majority of teachers who are coming into teaching are white, and they're ignorant about these systemic issues that are affecting our students. And so then our students are the ones who suffer.
Okay. So to play devil's advocate, I'm good at that. there are plenty of teachers. There's plenty of voices that state that pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Education, some made it. Why, if you work harder, you will. This is what it's always been. So, if when someone says that to you, or says that when you hear that, and you think about how that drives our kids into the disciplined population, how that drives our kids to the school to prison pipeline, what about racial equity needs to be taught or informed, or what kind of training do we need to do?
Well, that bootstraps theory is a myth, and that certainly doesn't apply to Black students, never has, never will. So people who have that argument, it's like they're on another planet. Like, I can't even begin. They can come to one of my sessions and I can start from the beginning because obviously they're, ignorant about a lot of things. But I think a remedy is culturally responsive teaching, because that is all about like empowering and liberating Black students by including cultural references in their learning, by having like authentic experiences and collaborating with community partners and with family, and also teaching students about social justice. Like, students can be social justice warriors just like we are, so having those things embedded into the curriculum as part of the curriculum is, I think, one of the big things that's going to help move us along. The first thing I would say is the educating educators about systemic racism and its effects and how we got to where we are. To me, that's first and foremost. You and I talk about that all the time. Teachers need to be trained, but also admin needs to be trained. It needs to be something that's happening throughout school districts, and it's not happening. So I think that has to happen first, and then the teaching in a culturally responsive way. That's something that I'm learning about right now, and I'll be going out to school districts and hopefully training up teachers on how to teach in this way. The hindrance, though, is TEA and the standardized tests. Because right now, the STAR test. Right now, teachers are so worried about the STAR test, and in some cases, their salaries are tied to STAR test results, that it's hard for them to incorporate culturally responsive teaching because they're so worried about kids passing a test, and they're teaching to the test, which is awful. So.
Yes. So we talked a little bit about racism. When I say we talked, I mean you and I talked. And can you please give people the story that you told me about? Because I think what your experience does, it's not a one-off experience, right? So this is what happens all the time. This is, well, not all the time, a lot of times. And people don't know how to approach it. They don't know. The offenders don't understand what they're doing. Sometimes those that have been offended don't know what to do. So if you could share your experience, I'd be grateful.
Yeah. So when my son was, many years ago, when my son was in kindergarten, he had some struggles just because he didn't know how to really interact with the other kids. He's the only child. He was, just a typical boy in many ways because he liked to play. He was very active. He wanted to be up and running around and touching things and playing and, just typical boy stuff. And I guess some of the ways he was playing was considered aggressive by the teacher. And the teacher was having trouble disciplining him. And she wanted, we had a meeting, with her, and I was there, his dad was there, and some other administrators were there. And the teacher was frustrated with his behavior and basically wanted, I don't know what exactly she wanted. I guess she wanted him out of her class or whatever. And in her frustration talking during the meeting, she said something to the effect of, you guys just need to drive him past a jail or something. And at that time, I didn't really have a big reaction or really react at all in the moment. I think everybody just kind of stopped for a second, and then somebody just continued the conversation and it was ignored basically. But thinking back on that experience, that's what we're talking about. And this was a white teacher teaching an African-American student and being so frustrated with him that she's recommending us to drive him past a jail. In her head, she sees his future as criminal. She sees him as he's going to be in jail because this is how he's acting now. This is her thought process. So if we have white teachers or any teachers who are already deciding that the students in their class, in this case, who are 5 years old, are criminals, that's a problem.
Yes.
But had that teacher received training on bias or racism or anything to the culturally responsive teaching, then she would have had more tools in the toolbox to address her bias and to be able to teach a student of color. But she didn't have those things. And I wasn't at that time woke enough to be, now this Monika, it wouldn't even have been, a lot of things would have been done differently, right? Because I know more than I knew then. But that's the experience that unfortunately a lot of our students of color are facing.
And that speaks to, last week we talked about implicit bias in the classroom, and that speaks to that, as well as just an overall, when I think of racial equity, I think about understanding that the system that we teach from is only a white perspective. The things that, the pedagogies that we teach, or the way that we teach kids are middle class, white, what is called corporate, but passive aggressive, and all those things, and it excludes the ability or the option to be a moving person, to be fluid. The things that you talked about at first. Is that what you consider racial equity when you think about racial equity training, when you think about informing and teaching teachers? Is that some of the things you would think about?
It's some of the things I would think about. It's not what I lead with. Because if I was speaking to a group of people of color, I might lead with that. A lot of the teachers are white, so it's hard to talk about divesting oneself from whiteness when you're talking to white people, although it applies to them too. It absolutely applies to them, because they need to divest themselves of whiteness as well, because we don't have to live by those standards of being anymore. And I think that definitely comes into play when you're talking about school discipline, because we've seen in the past schools disciplining students based on their hairstyles, which are usually African-American hairstyles like dreadlocks and things like that. That's whiteness, because those practices want us to assimilate and want us to appear white as we can. So that means no dreads, no braids, no colors, no, this and that.
Things like that.
So yes, some of the training that needs to be part of the training. And that is hard. It's hard for some people to get and to understand that everything that we do is rooted in white supremacy culture, because that's what America is. And we don't know any better, because we are all drinking the Kool-Aid, and that's how we grew up. We just thought it was normal. But when you think about it, it's all practices that were created by white people for white people that we're just supposed to deal with. And it also it wants us to assimilate. So yeah.
Okay. Again, devil's advocate. I'm asking, what I'm thinking about is, again, following along with the 1776 Commission, stating that we're bashing, we're criminalizing, we're criminalizing white behavior, we're criminalizing white actions, uh, white history, American history. We're making it divisive. I mean, excuse me. Um, why is it so important to have racial equity? Why can't we just fall in line and follow the education, the system as it is?
And I think when we're talking about like getting away from whiteness, we're not bashing white people. We're talking about white supremacy. At least that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about white people. I'm talking about, when I'm thinking of whiteness, I'm thinking of white supremacy. So I think that we need to, I'm sorry, what was the last part of your question? Because I had a thought and it just went out of my head.
So the purpose of that last question, the whole thing is, it makes it sound like what we're talking about is bashing white people, bashing white culture, bashing this. It's not about, for me, racial equity is not about bashing anything. And it's not, and it's, why won't we just fall in line with?
Yeah, and you said why do we need racial equity? That's where I was going. I don't know why my mind went blank. I think just we need it because our kids aren't getting what they need. You know, because like we said, the school system is rooted in whiteness, right? So that means Black and brown kids aren't able to navigate that system. Now, some can, and some can assimilate, and some can do well and have done well. I was one of those kids. Like I made straight A's in school. You know, I made straight A's and B's. Like I always passed my classes. I never had a problem in school. But that's not the case for a lot of Black students. So the equity part comes into the school discipline. You look at data all the time that shows us that Black students are over disciplined, and schools mirror society. In society, Black people are over policed. So what do you think is going to happen in school? They're over disciplined. So I think the need for racial equity just comes into play when we think about the history. I always like to think about the why, like how did we get to where we are now? You know, the anti-Black sentiment in the United States. You know, that got us to that. There's so many things it's so complicated. Like racism is so complicated that sometimes you don't even see it. It's just like breathing air and drinking water. You think it's normal until you really just break down the system and you see all the flaws with it and how it was never designed for us. So I'm just trying to help people understand the system, understand racism, learn the history of it, especially locally. Dallas has a deep racist history. There were bombings, just like you hear about in Alabama and Montgomery and Atlanta, different places, Mississippi. There were church bombings and people crosses in front of the houses. That happened in Dallas. People's homes, Black people's homes, when they moved too close to white neighborhoods, they were bombed. They had fire. They had crosses burned. We just never talk about it. So I, think that it's important to know your past before you can move forward with making positive changes for the future.
Thank you. That again, in everything that I'm doing with these talks, what I want to dispel is it's not about blaming anybody. It's about making equitable situations for all students, especially those kids that when we're talking about discipline, when we're talking about school, we I'll keep going back to this. There's a percentage of students, like you said, and when you think about 20 or 30% being in disciplined populations, that's a large amount of kids that are not getting it. And it is not the fact that we are saying we're bashing anything. It's the truth of a situation. It's facing the truth. It's understanding that you have to deal with situations before you can do anything. And all we want to do is make equitable situations for all students. Um, it's it drives me crazy that talk about we still do data research, we still pull reports, and the reports are still saying the same things that they've been saying forever. You know, and I have a friend um, that I work with. He's white, and when we first started our relationship, it was difficult for him because it was not really difficult, but he was afraid. And being afraid to talk about something never gets you anywhere. Because you never get a chance to make a change. So um, I think that's what, for me, is that what you're talking about for racial equity? Is it simply just the conversation? Is it only about equity, or is it about bashing?
Well, of course, it's about, conversation. I think a conversation can change someone's life. Some people just don't understand, and a lot of white people don't understand racism because they don't live it every day. From their perspective, nobody's racist because they don't see it. So having those conversations, telling stories, hearing people's testimony, hearing their perspectives is so powerful. And I think that more of that needs to happen, especially across races, because I feel like white and black people don't get together and talk about race enough. And I'm telling you, I've done it, and it's very refreshing to have those conversations with a white person, and just to have your perspectives and your concerns heard, and for them to share their stories and their perspectives as well. That's something that definitely needs to happen. And you bring up a good point, because I was thinking about that. And maybe that's something we could get together and do in the future, Leon, is having a conversation between white people and black people about, maybe, having a white teacher on and talking about these things, because having the conversation is what, sparks everything. And it's not about blaming or bashing white people. And I think a lot of white people have a lot of guilt, and that's why they don't want to talk about race and racism. But the white people today shouldn't feel guilty about what people did in the past, because they weren't here and they didn't perpetrate that. But right now, ignoring racism, not talking about it, pretending like it's not there, not even trying, that's the problem. That's perpetrating it even further. So I commend white people who are standing up against it, who are trying to educate themselves, reaching out, trying to learn more. That's what we all should be doing, not just white people. Black people need to be doing it too, because we have internalized racism that we have to.
I'm coming to that.
Okay, I'm gonna let you get to it, but we have to unlearn a lot of things. So.
No. You keep going, because I was just saying, I was coming to that. That's what we're getting. I want to get to also. And to be honest, I've thrown out all the questions, because this conversation is like the conversation we really need to have. So, but we're going to go from this, and I want to pull it back.
I can't even use my notes now, Leon. Right?
So I want to pull it to back to the classroom. I want to bring it local. And I want to touch on two things you talked about. When we've bought into, because we're talking, so some people might listen to this conversation and say, well, they're just talking about the normal things, talking about white supremacy, what's going on. So I want to bring it back to the classroom. How does what we're talking about affect the classroom? First, how does it affect a classroom where there's black and brown teachers teaching black and brown kids? and we still come up with the same problems? And how do how does this topic affect just like the overall? So when you think of classroom, you think about school, and then you think about, we won't even go up to TEA because we know how you feel about that. So we'll stick with the classroom.
They will never give me a job, probably.
Let's start with how does this actually affect the classroom?
Yeah, I think bias affects the classroom. It's bias that, people don't realize that they have, like well-intentioned, well-meaning teachers think that they can, walk into a predominantly Black school, and they have great intentions. They love the kids. They know they're not racist, but they still have bias. And Black people have bias too. Black people have internalized racism. We need the training too. So just because a teacher is Black doesn't mean she's a great teacher of Black students, because we drink the Kool-Aid of white supremacy as well, until we unlearn it and do the work to address our own biases against our own skin color, because we tend to over discipline Black students as well sometimes. Not all Black teachers, but some do, until we check ourselves on that. So I think, there's a need for the anti-bias training. There's a need for all of this, because a lot of the school districts and the schools, they aren't doing it. I taught in public schools for 10 years. Never, not one time did I receive any bias training, any racism training, not even any really culturally responsive teaching training that I can really ever remember. And I taught in Title I schools that were mostly like Latinx students, but never received. The most we did was like a, Hispanic Heritage Month celebration. They think that's being culturally responsive. So, yeah, culturally responsive teaching needs to be a thing. It needs to be part of the curriculum. And like I was saying earlier, it can be a challenge because teachers want to teach to the test and worry about standardized testing. But we have to come back to authentic experiences that we can, have our students engage in. Not just Black History Month, Hispanic Heritage Month, MLK Day. Okay, once a year, we're going to do this thing. It has to be embedded in the curriculum. So everything that they're learning, like if they're learning about poetry, okay, well, let's focus on Black poets. When I was in school, we didn't talk about any Black poets, but there's tons of them out there. There's, let's focus on Black poets. Let's, talk about learn about their lived experiences and their perspectives. And then let's write poetry in the way that they wrote it, or let's write poetry from our lived experiences as students and as teachers or whatever. And then maybe they can partner with community organizations to do like a spoken word night, and parents and community members can come listen to their poetry. That's the kind of authentic cultural experiences that students should be having, right, in school. But it's getting better, but until teachers are trained, because a white teacher's not going to know to do that. She's just going to teach from whatever curriculum she's been given. So that's part of the culturally responsive teaching that I'm still, learning about. There's much to learn, but those are some of the trainings that I'll be helping to facilitate in the future.
Thank you for saying what you just said. I really, that's because what people don't understand is that we all know Martin Luther King, we all know Malcolm X, we all know this, and they get brought up, one or two times a year and this, then it. But that's not the thing that drives, that helps someone see themselves. That's not the equitable part of education. That's not, if you're in a classroom that is 75% Black and brown, you can't teach being culturally responsive and being racially equitable. You don't teach the same thing. You have to incorporate, you have to take the steps you have to take the steps to say, okay, this is who I'm teaching to, This is what I need to incorporate. Since I don't know it, I need to spend more time. I need to understand where the kids are coming from, this, blah, 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 whatever you need to do. But that's culturally responsive teaching. That's racial equity. It is not about, oh my God, now we gotta change this and we're bashing this and we're taking away that and we're no. This person needs two boxes, like you said. This one needs one. This one doesn't need anything at all. So
Yeah.
let's just make it. Let's get it back to equitable. Now I want to get to that thing about internalized racism. I'm gonna let you go. I'm gonna turn you loose on that one.
I said what I said, Leon.
Okay, there you go. I said what I said, and that's what I said. I'm gonna move right on past that.
No, I could just, I learned about internalized racism just not too long ago. I mean, a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And people don't realize that, or Black people, brown people, they don't realize that, like I said, they're drinking from the cup or drinking the Kool-Aid of white supremacy. And I'll give you an example of how that shows up with students, because I had Hispanic students who would, when in 2016, when Donald Trump was elected, they came to school distraught. They were crying. They were scared they were going to be deported because of the racist rhetoric that he had already been spewing out about deporting, putting up a wall and all of that, right? So they came to school crying. We had to have like a meeting, and it was a big thing. And one of the students was saying, I don't even speak Spanish, I don't even, like, he was trying to reiterate how he wasn't in that group because he didn't speak Spanish. And I think he wanted to get rid of any type of markers of being a Hispanic person. He didn't want to speak Spanish. Like, he was already internalizing that I need to act white or appear white so that they won't mess with me, or so that I won't be deported or whatnot. So that's the kind of internalized racism I'm talking about. He was internalizing that white is superior, and if I appear Hispanic, I'm going to be deported. And it happens all the time. That was just one example of what I've seen. But with Black people, it starts with us from birth. I mean, we don't see any representations of beauty that look like us. We look at TV, and it's gotten better now, of course. But when you and I were growing up, there was nothing. You did not see representations of what it means to be Black. And so we internalized the notion that white was superior and better. And so we would try to act in those ways. And I found myself acting in those ways, getting perms and straightening my hair and doing all of this and that. And that's what internalized racism is. And until we acknowledge that and start doing work and having conversations about it, it doesn't get better. But it has for me, and I'm so grateful for that. And I hope I can help other people, Black and students of people of color with that as well.
Thank you. That is a key thing to me, especially when I think about discipline. It is that it goes back to that being the good one and the bad one. And it's not, so we start associating someone's socioeconomic level or where they are or their background, and this is how they're going to act. So this is going to be this, and you have to pay more attention. But an experience is an experience, and an expression is an expression, and all of it is worthwhile. All of it is Black. All experiences are Black experiences until they're not Black experiences. And that was, I forgot her name, but I heard her say that. I've watched her comedy special, but I loved it. But it is, there is no good or bad. There is just, they're kids. They're learning how to be who they are, understanding what they need to be successful. To be successful as a Black student, you have to see Black examples. You have to know that there's a way of being. And it doesn't mean that it has to be the good this or the good that. You can be who you want to be. You can be successful. Now, does that mean you get to act up and do what? We're not talking about We talked about this last week. That doesn't mean that I enable you to be a knucklehead. What it means is that I understand where you're coming from. I give you the boxes you need so that you can see over the fence, and then I hold you responsible for what you're doing. But what I can do is if I'm equitable and if I am culturally responsive, then I take the time to give you something to aspire to, because that's what we're having. That's the problem with the system that's rooted in whiteness. There's nothing to aspire to. And if that's not
nothing but whiteness.
No. So give me something to aspire to. Give me something to be, to have some type of engagement for. So I'm looking at the time, but what I want to do, I did a quick recap just there, but what I want to do is do a quick recap, and then I want to hear in your utopia, what would school look like? So we've talked about racial equity, we've talked about culturally responsive teaching, we talked about the fact that we're not bashing anybody, we're not talking about all white people are bad and this is this, we're talking about white supremacy, we're stating that equity is about making a footing for everyone so that everyone gets what they need. Not equal, but equitable, right? So, and we've talked about the fact that it can be both it can be black, white, brown, blue. You know, it's not really about that. Everyone has their biases. We've bought in, some of us have bought into white supremacy, how we teach. We want to change that. What I want to know from you is, tell me your utopia and how we get there.
Yeah, I think that the utopia is, well, it's going to have to start with training. So the teachers would be receiving, like every school district would be making sure, or you know what, before the school district, they need to be getting it in college, right? So teachers who want to be students who want to be teachers are receiving this type of training in their college prep programs. They should be taking a course on bias. And I'll be the first one to teach it. If they want to hire me to teach it, I'll teach it all day. They need to take a course on bias.
Shameless plug, right?
Shameless plug, seriously, because if we can get them to understand it more in college, then when they get to the school district, they're not so lost. So that, I feel like that needs to happen first. And then also, you know, be nice to have a course in culturally responsive teaching, which I know is happening. I know they are doing a little bit more with that, but they still need to throw the bias and the racism in there too, you know, and just make it a make it a package. Like you have to take both of these classes. And then once they get to the school districts need to be doing ongoing training. And you know, DISD has finally started doing culturally responsive training. And I think they're training a little bit about bias and stuff now. So here we are in 2020, one of the biggest school districts in the United States is just now in this year deciding to do something about culturally responsive teaching and bias.
And that is 75%. I mean, it's
there you go.
Mostly Black and brown students.
5% white. DISD, the last time I checked the demographics, it was 5% white. And we're just now deciding.
Most of that is low socioeconomic level. So we're talking about poor kids that are fighting all the other things that are thrown in there. So yes, that is, I'm gonna let you keep going. I'm sorry.
No. You're exactly right. I mean, that's the sad part, that they're just now deciding that this is something that needs to happen. We also need more Black teachers. You know, something I learned recently is I was on another webinar and I was learning some more about, you know, equity and stuff. And when the lady that was speaking, I don't remember her name, but she said that Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision, I think it was in 1954, 55, that integrated schools, right? She said, you know what, that it was great, but it killed our population of Black teachers. Because when Black students integrated into a white school, do you think that white school is about to hire Black teachers? No. So a lot of those Black teachers didn't have a place anymore because the all Black schools were kind of going away, and those children were going into white schools. White people weren't coming into our schools. So what happens to the Black teachers? They leave the profession. And so that's why we have, the last time I checked, I think it was like 75% white teachers in Texas, or no, in the United States. 75% of teachers are white. That's a lot. But our population of students, though, is not, minorities are a bigger population than white students. So we need more Black educators. That's first of all. We have a lot of Latinx educators because of bilingual programs. And also the discipline, and you will agree with this. We need to create a new approach for school discipline that's less punitive. Why are we kicking kids out of school? We should never be sending anybody to the principal's office. That's something from 1955. We don't need to do that in 2020. Like, we should have ways for teachers to handle discipline problems. Maybe it's a counselor or a social worker who's handling those things. The principal has admin stuff to do. They shouldn't be disciplining students. You should have someone at the school who's helping kids deal with their emotions. There should be a curriculum for restorative justice and for, handling emotions and how to deal with conflicts and things like that. So we need more counselors and more social workers inside the schools. And I know DISD is working towards doing that. They still have a lot more work to do. And then the last thing I would say is, like, we need to do better just as individuals. Just when I say we, I mean like Black people, with just being able to influence the people in our sphere, the kids that we know, like whether it be our own kids, our nieces and nephews, or whoever that's around us, and helping to empower them. And so they can liberate themselves from whiteness. And so that we can just, be those positive representations that they need.
Thank you. So it sounds like we're still on the same road that I've been talking for the last 3 weeks. Is that we're not talking about, we're not bashing, we're not blaming, we're talking about equity. We're talking about creating situations, programming, policies, practices that will benefit all students. That includes the students that may seem different from you, may be difficult for you. When we talk about that, we're thinking about administration, spending less money on criminalizing things and more money on building the emotional well-being of our students and all students, not from a white perspective, but from a culturally responsive perspective, that being Black, brown, Native American, whatever, people of color. It has to be that. People of color don't need one month a year. They need every day. If I'm going to school, if I'm in a classroom full of Black people, teach me the way Black people learn, the way how I live. Show me that it's a possible way to make, be a better person, do a good thing, be a proud father, whatever it is that needs to be done. That's what we're talking about. I really appreciate your time today. Low key, I'm a big supporter and a fan. So it's like, go Monica, go Monica. So, but I just want to thank you for being on here today. Thank you for sharing your views, and thank you for the frank conversation and for telling about what you experienced. And I thank you guys for being with us today for a pep talk. And we're going to hold off until after the new year, which we'll start with discipline and the law. So the criminalization of discipline. And we'll talk about that at the beginning of the year. So you guys have a wonderful night. Thank you again, Monica, for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
I did as well. Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.